Welcome back to the Sidetracked Sport podcast. I am your host, Jasmine, and today's episode we're going to be discussing faith and sport, specifically from a Muslim perspective. I myself am not religious, but I'm joined by Ruqayyah, who is, and she also has completed a master's in race, media and social justice last year. And she was also an education coach for Tottenham as part of the Premier League Inspires programme. So in this episode, we'll be talking all about Ruqayyah's experience as a Muslim woman in sport, the barriers that Muslims may face within sport, and what maybe we think can be done to try and overcome those barriers and improve it for young people coming through sport as well. But before we get into all of that, Ruqayyah, hello. Do you want to just give yourself a little introduction to our listeners?
Hi, Jasmine. Thank you so much. I can tell that you really did your research. The intro was amazing. Thank you again. I suppose to add on to that, just was a bit of context in terms of my cultural background. So I am half Jamaican, half Nigerian. And the reason why I mention that is because I'm first gen born Muslim. So I was born into the faith, but my parents both converted to the faith. So that kind of, I suppose, colors my experience, which may be slightly different to somebody whose parents have kind of ancestors have been Muslim for generations. And then obviously I also have a particular cultural experience because of the fact that I am Black, and the Black Muslim experience can be quite varied compared to, for example, the South Asian Muslim experience or the Arab Muslim experience. In terms of sport, as you mentioned, I did used to work for Spurs, still do in a different capacity. So football's definitely where I have more of an insight, but kind of have a general interest in sport and as specifically with regards to athletes of faith and how they navigate the sports space. So yeah, that's me.
Nice. And so we'll sort of start back, all the way back when you were young, maybe. How is it that you initially got into sport? Did you start with like school clubs? Did your parents sign you up to things? How did you get into sport?
Right, so that's a great question. I have quite an unconventional experience because my parents, like I mentioned, they converted to the faith of Islam. They decided that they wanted their children to be educated at least at sort of like primary level in a Islamic setting, which meant that I didn't go to a mainstream state school. I went to a Muslim school, which essentially was created as I got older. So it started off as sort of like a homeschooling collective, which my mum was involved in, and then now it's a registered school which is still running, but faith-based school. So through that school, because we weren't a state school, I must admit PE wasn't a massive part of what we did. Like obviously we'd have like playtime and things like that, but it was just sort of the teachers just making things up as they went along. There weren't necessarily any qualified PE teachers, which is the case in a lot of faith schools because of budget and finance and things like that. But luckily, what introduced me to sport was actually more martial arts. So I suppose slightly unconventional, but basically I studied a martial arts called Wing Chun, and that came about because when the school was started, we were actually based in sort of like an porter cabin that was connected to a mosque, and there was a martial arts teacher who himself is a revert to the Muslim faith, who kind of saw all these kids running around after he'd prayed at the mosque and was like, "Oh, what's going on here?" Kind of spoke to my mum and some of the other founders of this collective, which obviously was turning into a school. And he was like, listen, I'm happy to teach for free. So that was when we kind of started to have structured lessons as part of our general school experience during primary. I ended up going to his private lessons, which he would do in his own base with other children so that I could be a bit more advanced. And I ended up studying Wing Chun from about, I think, the age of about 4 or 5 at school up until I was in my early 20s. And I actually ended up going to the adult class and also teaching kids. So that was my main introduction. Outside of school, my mum was also very passionate about finding safe spaces for us. So we did manage to, for example, access some like women only swimming lessons in a local school, and we do things like aqua aerobics whenever we found women only sessions. And then I think as I kind of became a young teen, I sort of started to seek out spaces which would do kind of more, I suppose, conventional fitness sessions. So, you've got a lot of women like Liana Deeb now, for example, who obviously teams up with Shark. There's a lot of women like her that were coming out when I was a teenager. So I started to go to those sessions. And then I suppose just a caveat as well before kind of move on, because of the fact that I did cover from a very young age. And when I say cover, I wore the headscarf and I wore the abaya, which is a long garment. It was very limited in terms of the spaces that I could work out in. So school was fine, you could work out with boys, the girls, but then obviously as soon as I kind of got older, especially once I started secondary, it became more limited. And bearing in mind, this is easily 10 to 15 years ago. So there wasn't as much in terms of like women only spaces. So I think that's something that limited my ability to kind of, for example, play football or play other more traditional sports. But yeah, that's how I got into it.
That actually kind of perfectly moves on to what I wanted to talk to you about next, because I wanted to sort of explore and think about if there were any instances where you felt that maybe your faith and sport kind of didn't seem to like fit together. Like, for example, you said about how you'd wear a hijab and an abaya, and that would maybe limit what sports you could do. Are there any other sort of examples or instances that you're happy to share where those two things just didn't really seem like they merged very well?
Yeah, I think so. I don't like to kind of just put it on the outside factors. I also like to look internally at us as a Muslim community. I think that culturally, and again, I'm really grateful that this has changed in the last few years, but culturally, I felt a little bit like if you were a woman, a young woman, older woman who's really into sport and health and fitness, is something that didn't really fit culturally with the narrative of kind of being a conventional Muslim woman who wanted to practice her faith and be committed to her faith. That faith itself does encourage us to keep our bodies healthy, and obviously part of that is working out in whatever capacity you are able to, obviously without compromising your faith. But I felt that, as soon as you kind of get to that teenage age, especially if you do cover, a lot of our socializing evolved around very unhealthy habits. So it evolved around getting together with your friends and eating. And, obviously we all go out and eat, but it's like if that's the only thing that you do and you don't, for example, do other fun activities where there is some physical element to it. So, even like, for example, going bowling, for example, like, yes, it's not sport, but it's still, you've got some movement about you and stuff like it's just something that wasn't really done. And then obviously what ends up happening is that, you go to the mosque for an event and there's food. And then often the food is not very healthy. You go out to catch up with your friends and again, food. So like a lot of that obviously then ends up kind of adding up. And yes, we, as Muslims, we love to be hospitable and we like to eat and we like to feed others. But I think again, there wasn't a lot of thought, especially on the female side of like, okay, well, we need to make sure we're looking after our bodies, or maybe we should catch up in a way that also promotes some sort of physical activity. So I don't know, go out for a day in central London, be on our feet, get our steps in. I just felt like culturally that wasn't something that was the done thing. And I've heard similar from other women that I have spoken to more recently since I've got more involved in sport. So I think, like I said, it's changed a lot, but I think that that was something that was at a detriment in particular to women. And I think sometimes there was also a label of you're a bit of a tomboy if you were somebody that you was a girl that was quite into sport, and it was seen as kind of unladylike, or somebody could be sporty, but then it's like, okay, I'm going to settle down and have a family, and now that's not befitting of a married woman, for example. So I think that all of those sort of negative stereotypes again, I emphasize that it's cultural because the faith actually promotes kind of your health and well-being and keeping fit. I think that that was very detrimental. In terms of, I suppose, external factors, to be honest with you, I think because of the kind of person that I am, I never really faced much negativity from people because I'd like to think I'm quite eloquent. I try my best not to judge people too much because sometimes people just don't know. So if there is a bit of ignorance there, I'm more than happy to like explain to people like, okay, I do want to get involved in this, but could you, for example, make this kind of arrangement for myself so that I can feel a bit more comfortable in this class? I think also for me, even though generally speaking, I am strictly in women only spaces, I am a little bit more laid back than some of my friends. So I will wear, for example, like modest gym wear and go to a mixed gym. I will prefer to go somewhere where you have like a women's section. So I went through a phase where I was very on gym in my early 20s, and I used to go to a pure gym in Finsbury Park, which had a women's section. But then if you wanted to use some of the like specific machines, you did have to go into the mixed area. But again, I always had like my headscarf on. I had something that I felt would kind of cover me enough and then do that or go at quiet times. So I think for me, I was able to navigate my way around. And then if there were specific classes or specific spaces, it would be things like you'd find classes where, for example, it might be women only, but sometimes there might still be a camera running, which I understand is for security purposes. But if myself as a woman or other women in the class do really want to get into it and don't want to feel like they have to wear their headscarf or dress overly modestly, for us, it's like if somebody's checking those cameras and, it's a male, that's an issue. But again, if you go to the right leisure centre, if you have enough of you that go and can have that discussion, there are a lot of places that are willing to kind of make those arrangements for you, especially if they see that you're committed. So, yeah, I haven't necessarily had much negativity outside, but again, maybe I've not really felt it because of the fact that I'm quite comfortable having those discussions.
Mm.
And if I have ever gone anywhere and I've really felt like, you know what, you guys are not really willing to listen and you're not very respectful, I just take my money and my business elsewhere. I've never kind of had a problem doing that. So yeah.
I think that's quite interesting how you've sort of related it back into different aspects. So whether it be sort of a cultural experience and also even just the idea of cameras being in a women's only section. I'd never thought about that as what could potentially be an issue for some people, and that sort of be another barrier to it, because I mean the women's sections in gyms alone typically are really, really small and maybe
Mm.
have a couple treadmills, maybe a stairmaster, some really light dumbbells and like a hip thrust machine and maybe a squat rack, and like that's it. And
Yeah.
like you said, if you're wanting to use some of the other machines, or maybe if those machines are taken, you have to go out into the mixed area, and that's maybe not okay for everyone to do. They might not feel comfortable doing that. And I think
Yeah.
also something I want to go into a bit more on that you've kind of touched on a little bit is a barrier that to me, as someone external looking in, seems like quite a big factor for Muslim women is the lack of inclusivity and thought around sports kit, because a lot of sports have a kit that you're not only expected to wear, but maybe sometimes penalised or disqualified if you don't wear. And it's pretty common knowledge, I would say, that Muslim women often have a choice to dress more modestly, and modesty is different for every person. It's not the same.
Mm.
But a lot of sports kit is very tight. It's maybe quite short, especially for women. And that doesn't fit with a lot of people's ideas of modesty, whether they're Muslim or not. For example, in sports like gymnastics, you have to wear a leotard. That's
Mm.
not up for discussion. Even women who are non-Muslim may feel uncomfortable wearing a leotard. I did gymnastics when I was younger, and I always just preferred to wear some shorts over the top or some leggings.
Yeah.
You just feel more comfortable that way. But in competitions, you had to wear just a leotard. You couldn't wear leggings. You couldn't wear shorts. And for me, that was fine. I was like, oh, okay, I just prefer to wear shorts, but I can just wear a leotard. But for someone who they're trying to dress modestly, that is a massive barrier. And again, with sports, maybe like netball and hockey, you're expected to wear sort of a skort, which is, again, really, really short. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable wearing on that short, let alone someone like yourself who's maybe trying to dress more modestly again. And it's all of these expectations of kit. It's adding that extra layer and extra barrier to a lot of women, and especially a lot of Muslim women who maybe want to do sport, but they can't see how they can participate if that's what they're expected to wear. And I guess, is there any sort of sports that you've wanted to do? You mentioned football earlier. Is there any sports that you've wanted to do, but maybe the kit has sort of prevented you from maybe participating as much or for as long as you'd like?
Yeah, so again, I think my experience is it's not that I think I've always been interested in sport, but because I knew that it was exclusionary, especially when I was young, because like I said, there has been some change since, and I think there are a lot more women, Muslim or otherwise, who are breaking down barriers. But I think for me, I felt very comfortable, like I said, doing martial arts. For example, when I used to teach the kids class, I would wear my full abaya, and it wasn't an issue because there was that understanding of like, okay, well, she can still train, she can still do what she needs to do. Yes, I might wear something a little bit shorter, so I have a bit more freedom to move around and I don't trip over and things like that. But it was just something that was accepted as something that was normalized amongst parents, etc. I think when it comes to other sports, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't even, up until now that I'm obviously an older person and I'm kind of exploring sport in a very different environment. But back then I didn't even entertain the idea of getting involved in any of these other sports because of various reasons, including what you've just mentioned in terms of uniform. I think for me, at the moment, and I know I'm kind of like answering your question, but not answering your question, but I think what the point that I've got to now, especially having worked somewhere like Spurs for so long, and kind of I'm the type of person that even though I don't necessarily work very high up the ladder, I like to speak to lots of different people that are in management and that do have a certain level of power. And it's very similar in terms of like my background, even in education. I think if you want to make change, you have to be in those positions, you have to be in those spaces. And I understand, like, if managers are good, even if they don't come from that reality. So even if they, for example, are not from a cultural community where there's certain expectations on men and women in terms of the way they behave and interact, which may impact the way they engage with sport or covering, etc. If they really care about inclusivity, especially if their sport or if their team is based in a space where there is a very multicultural set of participants that you could engage, then, really and truly, if you're a good manager, even if you're not from that background, you should want to know, you should want to explore, you should want to engage with that community and then make those adjustments accordingly. But the reality is a lot of people don't necessarily have that mindset, or they're just not really that bothered. So I think having people like myself that can potentially get into those spaces, whether it's just in an advisory capacity where you kind of have the ear of those people and they're able to listen and you're able to recommend, or you actually work in those spaces where you can then make a difference. I think that that's what needs to happen, because I honestly feel that the reason why in so many sports, especially like you said, with relations to the female attire for so many different sports, which, whether you're a person of faith or not, you may feel uncomfortable with. I think a lot of it is just, to put it bluntly, there's a lot of kind of very old school white men who these in these positions of power who kind of make these decisions without much consultation of what's actually going on the ground. And then the people on the ground who are generally a lot more diverse and obviously are the ones representing those sports on different stages, they don't often feel that they have the power to say something. So I think that that's something that needs to change in so many sports to make it more inclusive, because similar to yourself, I have, a lot of friends from different backgrounds, who are of different cultural backgrounds, different faith or no faith backgrounds. And I have spoken to people, and there's a lot of them that just say, you know what, on certain days, I don't necessarily feel comfortable wearing XYZ. But I know especially if you're somebody who wants to excel in a sport, who wants to compete at certain levels, I kind of feel like that's my only choice. And then one other thing I did also want to mention is, for example, somebody like myself, I've always suffered with eczema. So that's something that, again, for me, even if I wasn't a person of faith and didn't cover, I feel very self-conscious because of
Mm.
discoloration in certain parts of my body and stuff like that. So there's other reasons other than just faith that would make you feel like, okay, you know what, I would prefer to wear something that isn't, for example, as skimpy as what is registered. And a lot of it, feel as well, from a feminism point of view, and talking specifically about women, I feel like it's quite backward. I feel like we should have variety. Yes, everyone should be safe. You shouldn't be wearing things that are going to hinder you, that are going to cause you injury. But at the same time, I think you can balance the modesty aspect with the uniform. So that, I think that's systematic change that needs to take place.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really important to acknowledge what you said about having people in the hierarchical sort of spaces that can reflect and think on a diverse range of people's experiences, because like you said, it typically is older white men that are in these hierarchical positions, and maybe by no fault of their own they don't think of these things, but that's why you need other people in those spaces. And it doesn't necessarily it's not a tick boxing exercise. That's not what it is, and which a lot of people may think that's what it is. It's more, you need a diverse range of people's minds to consider a diverse range of things and issues and contexts, and that's how you make things better for everyone. Because like you said, a lot of the problems with kit that we've discussed aren't just an issue for Muslim women. Most women will feel uncomfortable at some point in some form of kit. It's not that every non-Muslim woman is happy wearing a leotard, and so having these discussions, whether you're Muslim or not, it's bringing these ideas in, and it makes it better for everyone. And I think also what you were saying, it very well highlights the difference that there maybe is between men and women's experiences in the Muslim community, because a lot of the famous Muslim athletes that we know, I'd say, are men. I think if you were to go on the street and ask them to name a Muslim athlete, I don't think many would be able to name a single woman. I think, in my opinion, the ones that would come up the most are probably Muhammad Ali, Mo Salah, and Mo Farah. I don't
Yeah.
think there would be many answers outside of those three. I think that would be the consensus of most people, that that's who they'd name. But
Yeah.
I think it's important that we are getting more Muslim women compete at, not just at the elite level, but at grassroots level as well, which is just as important, and showing young Muslim girls that they can do that sport, which is a big thing. Because like you said, a lot of some sports you just didn't even entertain the idea of doing.
Yeah.
And part of that is this idea that is you can become what you see, and seeing someone in that position plants that idea in your head of, oh, maybe I could do that. And it might end
Yeah.
up being something you just have no interest in, but it's at least something there that you can consider and you can have a go at if you want to. And so on that, I was wondering if there were any sort of Muslim sportswomen that you specifically looked up to growing up, and whether that was from maybe a really young age, or is there any that you sort of look up to now?
I think majority, if I'm honest, kind of I look up to sort of from my teenage years onwards. And then a majority of, I would say, in it that I may mention now are literally in the last couple of years because of the reasons that you mentioned. I think when I was younger, it was definitely more a appreciation for male Muslim athletes. And even then, one thing I would say about the male Muslim athletes, and again, I know it's a difficult space to exist in. Everyone practices their faith in a different way. So I'm not kind of here to judge anyone individually, but I think with men, because of the fact that Islamically, women just generally look more outwardly Muslim. It's not something you can hide. It's not something that, especially if you do cover, and even women that don't, oftentimes, like, for example, you'll still have to cover up to pray, etc. So, if you are in the public space and you have to kind of whip a scarf on and pray, like people will know, as well as obviously like from your name and things like that. However, obviously that's similar for men. And I think because of that, a lot of the Muslim male athletes, their Muslimness doesn't have to be so obvious. I mean, people will know, but it's not like, oh my God, like, you see me praying, or it might be like during Ramadan, especially like since the last year's Ramadan, particular, for example, in games like football, we saw kind of like obviously referees being informed and then Muslim players going to the side and breaking their fast, even if it's just with some water, these sorts of things happening. So people are kind of having more awareness. And I think that it obviously is part of why maybe Muslim women have kind of taken a while to really come to the fore in various sports. In terms of people that come to mind, so there's one main figure that comes to mind, and the reason why I'm going to mention her specifically out of others is because she is a Black Muslim woman and she's also West African, and I am half West African. So when I kind of found out about her, most probably about 2 years ago, it was such a big thing because, oh my God, she literally looks like me. She covers like me. So there is a lady called Zainab Alima, and she is a rugby player. She plays for Richmond, if I'm not mistaken. She's gone through a very long journey. And this is another reason I feel as well that there's a lot of women that in various sports that they did have ambitions, but because of sometimes community pressure, cultural pressure, because of just life gets in the way, I feel like they don't reach the heights of men. Because obviously, somebody like Mo Salah, like the reality is, a lot of men, they're not the ones having the children or having to pause their career, so they can continue on that path. Whereas a woman, like, obviously it's her right, to want to have a family or to want to do certain things in her life, but she does end up a lot of time having to step back because of the toll on, your time and your body, etc. So with Zainab Belima, she grew up in South London. She was introduced to rugby at school and she was just really, really good at it. But I think a lot of people may or may not know, and something that I learned after I worked some rugby games at Spurs and spoke to fans. I didn't realize it was very much sort of a middle to upper class sport, in terms of a lot of the pathways come from private schools, public schools, as you call them, etc. So it's not that people from more marginalized backgrounds don't get in, but there's already that barrier. But luckily she had the support of teachers, etc. But then I think because of a cultural kind of perspective, it was like, okay, rugby can't be a proper job. So she ended up becoming a midwife, which, she's still very grateful that she did that job role. She got married, she had three daughters. So, she kind of did all of that. But luckily for her, she had a husband that was very supportive and she still continued rugby, even like after like short maternity leave. And she's got stories of like taking her youngest to like the dressing room and
Mm.
kind of having her on the sidelines while she plays, so she just was really committed. And then she kind of started this campaign, which is popularized by social media to kind of get to eventually, hopefully one day, someday soon, get into the England women's rugby team. So yeah, she's just joined this Premiership team. She's the first Muslim woman who covers to play in a rugby Premiership team. And I've met her a few times at some recent awards, so Black Muslim Awards and Muslim Sports Awards. And I think even though obviously like it is a bit of like, oh wow, like I kind of look up to her and it's a bit of a fangirl moment, but I feel like I'm kind of speaking to somebody I know because there's just so many similarities culturally. And I think completely appreciate like the fact that she's had to overcome a lot of barriers to get where she is now and she's still on her journey. So I think again, to have somebody like her who's very openly Muslim and who's black and Muslim,
Mm.
are very proud of it. I think that's something that I never really saw before. I felt like you'd always have the odd like Arab or Asian Muslim. So for example, you've got people like, forgive me if I missaid her surname. I think it's Nadia Naim. I think she's an Afghan refugee footballer. Grew up in Denmark, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember where she's playing now, but like she's a Muslim footballer. She's one of the first ones that I found out about. Again, you wouldn't necessarily know because her name. Yes, some Muslims have the name Nadia, and I understand like playing in Scandinavia, being a refugee. Sometimes you don't want to be shouting over the rooftops, but I realized that as time has gone on, she's had more and more interviews where she's spoken more openly about
Mm.
her relationship to faith. Um, so yeah, I think that in terms of the intersectional identities that we're seeing in sport, it's definitely diversifying compared to before. And for me, that's a big thing considering my own identity.
And so for me, whilst I'm not Muslim myself, a Muslim athlete that I particularly love and respect and admire is Safan Hassan. And for
Oh,
those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with who she is, because her name's not one of the biggest, I don't think. She, this summer in the Olympics, well, last summer now, I guess, she won bronze in the 5K, bronze in the 10K, and then went on to win gold in the marathon. And the amount of distance she ran in the Olympics was absolutely crazy because she had to run heats for the 5 and the 10K and then ran a marathon after that. But not only did she have a really impressive medal haul, it was the first time someone had medalled in all of those three events in the same Olympics since 1952. And her gold medal for the marathon was the last one to be presented during the Olympics. And that was significant because she decided to wear her hijab on the podium. And for those of you who maybe don't then instantly know why that's significant, France had banned their athletes from competing in the hijab. So to me, seeing the last medal of the Olympic Games being presented to a Muslim woman wearing her hijab, whether it was intentional or not, it was a very big statement against France's decision to ban those athletes from covering. And I think that alone was quite a significant moment of the Olympics for me that I feel like wasn't spoken about as much as I'd have hoped. And whenever I mention it to people, they maybe don't really realize who Safan Hassan is, and I show them a picture of her and they're like, oh yeah, I do remember her actually. And I think she needs to be spoken about more because that was a big decision for her to make. Whether she, like I said, whether she made it consciously or not, I'm not sure. You'd have to try and ask her, and whether she'd answer, who knows. But I think that alone was quite a big stand to take, and she sort of took her moment to show she's proud of who she is and to sort of show maybe some solidarity with French Muslim athletes as well. And I think that was a pretty amazing moment of the Olympic Games.
yeah, I mean, now that you mentioned her, I was kind of very much a part of that whole time when obviously she did wear her hijab and was observing a lot of the commentary. I think that one thing I would like to mention, I suppose, in relation to her statement of action, but just generally statements of action that you may see from athletes, particularly Muslim athletes, is I think whether we like it or not, sport is political, and I think that there are a lot of Muslims, especially Muslims in the diaspora, who are living in, for example, in Europe, in Canada, in the US. They're not living in their native countries, and obviously they've made lives there. We're talking obviously specifically about sport. There's many sports people like Mohammed Salah, who obviously native Egyptian, but obviously, you're doing really well in sport. Yes, you play for your national team in tournaments, but in order to kind of really reach the heights of your career, you kind of need to go abroad, to places like Europe to play in the top leagues, which many like him have done, for is in particular the last sort of 15 years or so in sports like football. And I think it's really important to understand the fact that I think a lot of the time as Muslims, we can feel quite helpless because our narratives in the media are sort of written for us. And I would like to think that Sifan, when she stood up on that stage, obviously, yes, she wants the main focus to be her achievements in sport. Obviously, she's very proud of breaking a record and making history, but she also understands that like being a Muslim woman is such a big part of her identity, and she's in a country, she's in a situation where she's able to, like I said, whether it was intentional or unintentional, to show solidarity. And another thing, going back to like Zainab Belima that I mentioned, the rugby player, when they had the World Cup, if I'm not mistaken, in France, the Rugby World Cup, she actually went and she presented some of the medals. And a lot of women, again, it wasn't intentional, she was just invited because of her story, that had grown traction online in terms of her trying to get into the England team and getting to the Premiership. She had obviously been invited, I think she was invited by Land Rover as one of the sponsors, to come down and be on the pitch. And there were so many Muslim women in France who messaged her and reached out to her. And she made a video about this, about how, they just felt so kind of like they felt hopeful in that moment that, look, somebody like yourself can come and, we would never imagine being able to do something that you're doing as French women in our hijab, but yet, you are given that opportunity. So it gives us some hope. So I think that, like, for men and for women, but particularly for women that do cover or have very visible symbolism of their faith, it can be a really powerful thing to be on a world stage as a sports person. And just by existing on that stage, like by, you kind of being showing the world that we do exist, we deserve to be here, and we are, positive contributors to sport and wider society. And I think that's something that is being picked up on more and more. And I think not just Muslim athletes, but I think just generally people that are involved in sport, figures like, for example, Gary Lineker, who are expressing opinions about what they feel about the politics in the world. This is something that I feel has always been close to the hearts of a lot of Muslim athletes, but we felt scared because of like Islamophobia and our careers in sport potentially being at risk if you do say anything, even if it's quite a mellow, like humanitarian opinion. It's like, I just don't want to get into that. Whereas now I think that landscape has changed a lot, particularly post-COVID.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important statement and idea to sort of for people to take away listening to this, that sport is political. Like, no matter how much you try to deny it, point blank, politics and sport cannot be separated at all. They are intertwined. You physically cannot separate them. And a lot of people, I do think, like to try and deny that. They like to go watch their local team at the weekend and, cheer on whoever's on the pitch, and like to pretend that wider issues that are integrated within sport just don't exist. I think they quite like the naivety that they can try and pretend that they have through sport. Whereas you go to a football game, some players might be getting racist abuse hurled at them, but some people will like to ignore that. It's like, well, that's a perfect example, which happens still all too often, of how they are so intertwined and you can't separate them. And I think as we come to the end of the podcast, that's something that I'd like all of the listeners to sort of reflect on. And I don't know, like as you go to sports events, see if you can see how maybe politics are being sort of used as a leverage within the sport. And yes, not everything has to be political. You can still enjoy sport. We're not saying that you have to sit there and analyze everything, but I think it's quite important to think quite critically about why things happen within sport. How does that happen? What impact does that have on sport and politics, and vice versa? And I think that's quite an important thing to take away from this, really. So we're coming to the end of the podcast now. I just wanted to get one last thing from you, Ruqayyah. If we could have one sort of call to action thing, what would it be to sort of improve the experience of or the Muslim experience of sport, what would that call to action be for you?
Yeah, I think this is something that sort of started happening, and it's something that I actually wanted to mention. So, I'll end with it. There are organizations like Najum Sports, which is an organization which was started a couple of years ago by a guy who actually used to work for the FA Muslim called Ibadur Rahman. And he kind of started off supporting largely football players, but also supports other Muslim athletes across various sports. And the reason why he started his organization was he realized that a lot of these players were not being advocated for, and there was a real lack of education when it came to a lot of these different educational bodies. So he basically created training. He networked, liaised with different clubs to, for example, make sure they have a prayer space, so that if they have any Muslim athletes or just athletes of faith, period, like they have somewhere to pray and reflect, making sure people are catered for when it comes to Ramadan, all these things. And I think that there's a lot of clubs that for a long time, like I said, a lot of athletes didn't feel, they just felt like, okay, I've got to just show up as a sports person. So I'll just kind of leave my faith to the side, do it privately. But the reality is there's aspects of lots of different faiths that do require support from the club, such as, for example, when you fast in Ramadan, obviously that's a massive one where that does impact your play, that does impact your whole routine. So he's kind of bridging that gap and saying, you know what, if there are any issues that come up in your club as an athlete, we can advocate for you, we can support you, we can educate, and we can be that kind of body that the club, for example, that you represent, or the sports body that is looking after you, they can come to us and we can kind of liaise with them to make sure you're supported as an athlete, and not just the athletes that are there and there right now, but just laying that foundation. So if anyone else comes through the doors, it's not something brand new and they're able to kind of support them. So I think that it's just really important for, I suppose, just the lay fan to just have an awareness. And I think especially when we look at particular sports such as football specifically, we have such a large cohort of Muslim players, players of faith, so for example Christian players and players that come from diverse backgrounds, especially those who are not born in the UK. So the reality is everyone comes with their experiences, and I'd like to think that that's what makes them great athletes. But as British fans specifically, or European fans, wherever people may be, watching these different leagues and these different sports, I think it's important to kind of wake up a little bit and say, you know what, yes, we do want them to be part of our society. We do want them to understand, for example, the Britishness of football, or the Canadianness, for example, of ice hockey. But we also need to appreciate that, what makes them a great athlete, a great human being that contributes to this sport, is part of like their very multifaceted identity. So it's just to have an appreciation for that. And then I think if people have an appreciation for that, they'll feel more affected when those athletes are attacked for any of those unique identity factors, whether that be their race, whether that be their faith. It will be a thing of like, no, I care about that player, not just because of what they do on the pitch, but because of who they are. And if something's going to be said that is going to affect them, their mental health, and make them feel less than, then as a fan, I'm going to stand up, especially if my club is not doing what I feel needs to be done. So just a brief example, like recently with the FA Cup game between Tamworth and Spurs, there was one of their black players, forgive me, I can't remember his name, but he faced a lot of racial abuse, and the club was really, really like slow to kind of pick up and defend the player and say this was wrong. And, people kind of have called that out and said, look, why are we waiting for kind of fans and external people to put pressure? But the positive I took from that was at least fans have kind of are waking up, especially in such a small club. It's not a kind of an inner city club by any means. So it would have been easy to say, oh, well, we don't really care about that because that's not really our demographic. But people are like, no, we care about all our fans. Even if I myself am not black, I'm anti-racist and I don't believe that this is okay. So this is a sign that we're moving in the right direction, but we just need more wider collective of fans to really care. And I think that that will kind of turn the tide so that we are preemptive rather than reactive when this sort of discrimination happens to people.
I think that's a perfect way to end the podcast. It's that idea that first and foremost, athletes are human beings and we should be caring for them because they're a human being. And when something like that happens, if, like you said, if an organization isn't calling out or responding quick enough to something like an athlete receiving a lot of abuse, then as a fan, we should be putting pressure on that organisation to do so. Because, like you said, that does have an impact, and it forces them to take these things more seriously and actually address them at the heart of it, and not just sort of put out a statement every time it happens. It forces them to actually take action into trying to prevent things and show that they are actively against it rather than just responding to it when it happens. But yeah, that is the end of our podcast. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. It's been great talking to you, Ruqayyah. It's been really informative, and I hope everyone listening has learnt something new and can take something away from this. It has been great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. And thank you, everyone, for listening. I will see you in the next episode. Bye.